1930, work begins on the Hawks Nest Tunnel. It would be 3 miles long, and it would divert the New River to a hydroelectric power plant. But the construction is remembered as America's worst industrial disaster. One researcher counted 764 lives lost.
My husband, Cecil Jones, died of working in the Hawks Nest Tunnel, contracted silicosis.
The men were tunneling through solid silica, and the dust destroyed lungs through a disease called acute silicosis.
I lost 3 sons from working in the tunnel of silicosis.
And each and every day that I worked in that tunnel, I have to carry out from 10 to 14 men was overcome by the dust.
Many were buried in unmarked graves. The majority of those who died were African American.
Hello and welcome to 60 Minutes. We are your hosts. My name is Madison Lichtefeld and this is my co-host Whitney Smith. Today's topic, we will be discussing Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia in the early 1930s, where nearly 764 people died.
We have 2 special guests that will be joining us today. Wes Clevenger, a great-grandchild of a worker who's going to recall events that his grandfather experienced, and also Kayla Towns, an environmental specialist that is going to explain why silica is so damaging to the body.
Construction was started on Gully Mountain. Many migrant workers traveled from the south to Gully Bridge to try to find work. The job was to create a 3-mile-long tunnel between Anstead and Gully Bridge, West Virginia, to divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric plant downstream.
The water was planned to be used as an electricity source for Union Carbide's metal plant in Alloy, West Virginia. Construction of the tunnel began in the spring of 1930, and Union Carbide contracted Reinhardt and Dennis Company to help construct the tunnel under Union Carbide engineers. To try to save money, many corners were cut, resulting in what is known as the worst industrial accident in the United States.
The workers were blasting through 99% pure silica, and experts knew that silicosis was caused from the miners inhaling silica dust. The workers used a dry drilling technique that released large amounts of silica dust in the air. Because of this, workers were exposed to massive amounts of silica, and many died. We are now going to speak with Danny Montgomery, who is interviewing Wes Clevenger.
Hi, I'm Danny Montgomery, and I'm here with Wes, whose great-grandfather, Arthur, helped build the tunnel. Wes, do you know what made him want to help build the tunnel?
I don't really think it was a matter of wanting to help build the tunnel, Danny. It was post-depression in West Virginia. The area was very economically depressed, and to be honest with you, our family needed money. He was a young man. He was around 20 years old, so he figured that would be a good job for him. So he went to work. The company that was constructing the tunnel, they actually housed them in essentially shacks around the tunnel, and he would stay on site and work week by week at the tunnel site.
Now, Wes, what kind of side effects did he get from the silica exposure?
According to my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Arthur, he was always coughing. Day in, day out, he had this persistent cough, which eventually led to a diagnosis of lung cancer. He would also complain of shortness of breath and chest pain from time to time.
Now, when was he diagnosed with silicosis?
I think he was diagnosed in his 40s. It was about 17 years after he had actually stopped working for the tunnel company. Symptoms just progressed from an occasional cough to a persistent cough to full-blown lung cancer.
Did some of his other coworkers have any symptoms like he did?
They did. Even the ones that only worked there for a short amount of time. My great-grandfather, he personally only worked there for a few months. But it seemed like the co-workers that were with him that spent more time actually down within the tunnel shaft and the construction of the tunnel, they were the ones who were most greatly affected. My grandfather would talk about, or my great-grandfather, he would talk about having to come out from time to time because the dust was so thick that it would just completely make him not be able to breathe. And so he would have to take breaks and come out, but some of the other workers didn't. They eventually died a lot sooner than my great-grandfather.
Were there any other interesting things you were told about working in the tunnel?
I do remember them telling me of the living conditions, and like I said before, Danny, they would house all the workers on site whenever they were building the tunnel itself. And like I mentioned, they were essentially shacks. And they said that the conditions were so deplorable and so ran down that, and the dust so thick that a lot of the times co-workers and my great-grandfather as well, they would come out of the mine shaft and they would be completely white because they would be covered in the silica dust. And, that took a toll on them after time.
The working conditions were horrendous. Workers were not given masks, even though experts knew how deadly silica dust can be. The only people that were given masks were inspectors and company managers when they were inside the tunnel. Many of the workers were told they had a disease called tunnelitis, even though it was known they had silicosis. Arthur's story is a similar story to most of the workers in the tunnel. Many started out with just a small cough or shortness of breath and ended with being diagnosed with silicosis later in life. Eventually, some other disease like cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and others occurred because of the silica exposure years ago. Now I would like to introduce Kayla Towns, an environmental specialist that is here to talk about silica and the effects on the body.
What exactly is silica?
Silica is a crystalline substance, and once you breathe it in, it can cause fiber buildup in the lungs that leads to you getting silicosis. It can be hard to diagnose since the symptoms are not shown in everyone because of the long latency period of 15 to 20 years. A chest X-ray is the only definitive way to know if someone has silicosis for sure.
What effects does it have on the body?
Silica causes scar tissue in the lungs, which decreases a person's ability to take in oxygen. At first, there only may be small symptoms like a shortness of breath, but as the disease progresses, the symptoms begin worsening. Your body becomes fatigued. You may experience chest pains, respiratory failure, and possibly result in cancer.
Are there multiple stages, or is it just one deadly stage?
There are usually 3 stages associated with silicosis, which are chronic, some people may call it classic, accelerated, and acute. Chronic or classic silicosis is the most common, and it occurs 15 to 20 years after moderate or low exposure to crystalline silica. Accelerated silicosis occurs usually 5 to 10 years after exposure of respirable crystalline silica. And finally, acute silicosis can happen in as little as a few months up to 2 years. Acute silicosis usually involves extremely high concentrations of silica. It often leads to death because of the disabling shortness of breath, weight loss, and weakness. It is a very harmful disease to the lungs.
Thanks, Kayla. A formal investigation was not started until 1936, which brought about the Walsh-Healy Act of 1936. The act stated it was unlawful for any company that performed federal contract work to subject their employees to unsanitary, hazardous working conditions. And from that investigation, it was decided that no action would be taken against Union Carbide, even though they were the company overseeing the construction of the tunnel. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has also set strict guidelines for proper respiratory protection to those who are exposed to silica.
Even though the official number of deaths is 764, it is estimated to be much higher than that. Because there were a large number of deaths, many of the workers were buried on a nearby farm. Silica-related deaths have reduced drastically since air quality guidelines and respiratory protection have been implemented. Deaths have declined by 93% from 1968 to 2002. This was a terrible disaster with many lives lost, but made way to reform to protect workers afterwards. I hope this episode on Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster was informative. Thanks for watching and have a great night.